In the history of the National Basketball Association, Kevin McHale is remembered as one of the most outstanding and efficient power forwards who ever played, a key pillar in the golden dynasty of the Boston Celtics in the 1980s, where he, along with Larry Bird and Robert Parish, formed the legendary trio that dominated the league, winning 3 NBA championships in 1981, 1984, and 1986. While constantly appearing in the most intense finals in history, he was selected to the All-Star team 7 times, won the Sixth Man of the Year award twice when he accepted the bench role to serve the collective benefit, appeared 3 times on the all-defensive first team thanks to his intelligent and disciplined defense, and was especially famous for his low-post skills that many experts consider the most perfect of all time. With spin moves and handling in tight spaces that were almost impossible to stop, his career ended with an average of nearly 18 points per game, at an extremely efficient shooting percentage, before being honored in the Hall of Fame in 2009 as recognition for the long-lasting legacy he left, not only titles but also the standard of technique and competitive spirit in professional basketball, a person who helped redefine how a player in his position could control the game without needing showmanship or external glamour. But behind all those achievements was a life that the spotlight could not cover, where Kevin McHale was used to enduring more than showing off. He played in his peak years with a body that was no longer intact, accepting to take the court with serious injuries so as not to weaken the team. And the price of those choices was the lasting pain that followed him for many years after retirement. But the physical was not the thing that knocked him down the deepest, because the greatest loss came from the family when his daughter, Sasha, passed away at the age of 23 from lupus, an event that could not be compensated in any way, no title strong enough to lighten it. And what made people tormented was not only that pain, but the way he faced it, without tears in public, without any complaints. He returned to work, continued life, as if everything was still intact, while inside it had changed forever. That was not indifference, but a rare form of strength, a will built from the habit of enduring, from putting responsibility above personal emotions, and from the belief that there were pains that did not need to be spoken, only needed to continue walking, even though each step carried a part of the memory that he would never be able to put down. Before stepping into the journey behind the spotlight of Kevin McHale, please hit like and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss untold stories about NBA legends. A small heart you leave today is the respect for a person who stood firm in silence, even when his life carried many unseen wounds. In the small town of Hibbing, Minnesota, where winters stretched endlessly and the roads covered in white snow made the whole world seem to shrink into silence, Kevin McHale grew up in a slow, discreet, and almost isolated rhythm from the bustle of major sports centers. It was not a childhood of harsh poverty, but a childhood lacking the warmth and emotional connections that a child needs to understand himself clearly. His family was still stable, still had basic care, but between members there always existed an invisible distance, where words rarely touched the heart and important emotions were often kept inside rather than shared. Kevin grew up in that quietness, not as the standout child in the crowd, nor as someone who easily fit in with peers. He often stood outside conversations, observing more than participating, listening more than speaking, as if the world around was always too fast while he was too slow to step into its rhythm. In class, he was not the one who drew attention, had no bursting confidence or extroverted personality, but was a boy who kept everything inside himself, and that very holding back gradually became an unchangeable part of his nature. Those who knew him from his teenage years remembered Kevin as a quiet child, somewhat distant, but by no means weak, just different in the way he existed among others. Basketball appeared as the only escape, a place where he did not need to explain himself with words, did not need to try to fit in through communication, but only needed to let his body and the ball speak for everything. In the long afternoons in the empty gymnasium, he repeated shooting motions, simple movements, as if each shot was a way to escape the loneliness surrounding him. No one knew clearly that for Kevin, the basketball court was not only a place to play sports, but the only place he felt he belonged to something clear, where there was no judgment by words, no awkward silences between people, only the repetition of actions and the stable rhythm of the game. But even in that environment, he still kept the habit of standing alone, not because there was no one around, but because that was the most familiar way for him to feel the world. While other children turned to basketball as a team game, Kevin turned to it as a private space where he could turn solitude into focus, turn silence into energy, and that very thing shaped the person the world later knew. An athlete who was not loud, not showy, but always coldly efficient. Behind that skill development was not noisy encouragement or constant motivation, but hours alone with himself, where he learned to rely on himself more than on anyone else. In the family, he was not the center of long conversations or deep emotional sharing, but the observer more than the one being listened to, and that gradually created an invisible void in the way he connected with the world. A void that was not clear pain, but a prolonged absence through the years. When other children learned to express emotions, Kevin learned to keep them inside. When others sought comfort from the group, he got used to handling everything in silence by himself. And what was worth saying was that no one really realized that that silence was not a sign of stability, but a form of adaptation, a way to exist in an environment where he never felt fully belonging. That very adaptation followed him throughout childhood, seeped into every step of growing up, and became the foundation for the person he would become later, a man who did not easily show emotions, did not easily share pain, but carried within him an inner depth that only he truly understood. And perhaps from very early on, Kevin McHale had learned something that very few people realize in their childhood, that there are people who do not grow up with the support of words, but with their own silence. And that silence, though no one saw it, was exactly what shaped his entire life behind. In his teenage years in Hibbing, Minnesota, Kevin McHale began to form a special relationship with basketball, not as a team game or a stage to be noticed, but as a private space where he could exist without needing to explain himself with words. The long practices in cold gyms, sometimes only the sound of the ball bouncing echoing in the emptiness, became a repeated habit, where he quietly honed every move, every step, every spin in the area near the basket, as if each small detail could decide his future existence, with no cheers, no bright lights, only persistent repetition in silence. And it was in that environment that his talent gradually grew without needing immediate recognition. McHale was not the type of player who attracted attention with flashy actions or showy playing style. He did not create moments that made the audience jump up immediately, but delivered near absolute efficiency in every handling. Every move under the basket had a coldly precise calculation, as if he always understood that basketball was not only the art of explosion, but also the art of perfect repetition. When he entered school games, then more competitive arenas, he still kept that style, quiet and efficient, not seeking to become the center of attention, but only seeking to fulfill his role as best as possible, and that made him a special player, but not easy to see, because while others impressed with standout qualities, McHale influenced with stability, but that very stability often caused him to be undervalued compared to his real ability. In the eyes of many, he was not the leader, not the representative face, but only a part of the system, a player who did his job well but did not leave a clear personal mark, and that created a quiet paradox in his journey. When his talent developed more and more, but recognition did not increase at the same pace, he continued to walk in silence, accepting the role behind more than in front, not because of lack of ability, but because he was used to not standing in the center, used to letting others shine first while he did the less noticed part. In every game, McHale was rarely the first one mentioned, but often the one who ensured balance and efficiency for the whole team. This made him the type of player coaches loved, but audiences easily overlooked. A person who worked the right way, at the right time, in the right role, but did not seek personal recognition. And that very thing deeply shaped the way he stepped into the professional basketball world later, when his talent had grown large enough not to be ignored, but the habit of standing behind remained intact, like an unchangeable part of his personality. And in that silence, a question gradually formed that no one really spoke out. How could a person become great in the eyes of the world when they themselves were used to never standing in the most clearly seen position? And the answer, if any, had already been written in the way he continued to play, without showmanship, without noise, only efficiency and persistence stretching through the years. When Kevin McHale stepped into the National Basketball Association, it was not a door opening to immediate spotlight, but a world that had been operating long before, a world that did not wait for anyone, where every position had to be earned through pressure, through endurance, and through the ability to adapt in silence. Joining the Boston Celtics in the most fiercely competitive period in the team's history, McHale was not given a central role, nor was there any guarantee that he would become an irreplaceable part right from the start. He stepped into a locker room where big names had already shaped the entire system, where every minute of play had to be proven by efficiency rather than expectation, and in that context he had no choice but to adapt really fast or be left behind. The practices became more intense than ever. Not only competition with external opponents, but also a silent battle within the team itself, where every small mistake could narrow opportunities. McHale understood that no one would stand up to protect him. No one would give him unlimited time to grow. Everything had to be proven right in every minute on the court, every touch of the ball, every move. And that very pressure gradually shaped a new person. A person no longer allowed to show weakness, no longer any space for hesitation or doubt. He was forced to learn to stay silent under pressure, learn to accept limited playing minutes, non-prominent roles, and turn them into the only opportunity to exist. In those early years, McHale was not the star mentioned by the media, not the representative face, but only a piece trying to prove that he could not be replaced. And that made his journey heavier than any glamour people usually saw from the outside, because behind every game was the feeling of having to prove his own value in an environment with no room for hesitation, where every player was fighting for their own position. And McHale, with a personality already used to silence from childhood, continued to step into an even harsher world, where silence was no longer a safe choice but became a condition for survival. He could not rely on fame, could not rely on the past, could not rely on any previous recognition. All he had was each moment on the court to prove he deserved to exist. And it was in that relentless pressure that a person who seemed used to solitude became even more closed off, but also stronger in a way no one could see immediately, because while the outside world only saw a player gradually fitting in, inside him was a continuous fighting process, not to be swallowed by the speed and harshness of the league. And from there, McHale's life stepped into a new phase, where all personal emotions had to step back to make way for one single thing: to exist and prove his value in a world that had never intended to wait for him. In the peak years of the Boston Celtics, when the lights of Larry Bird illuminated the entire National Basketball Association, Kevin McHale stood in a very special position. Not the center of every gaze, but an indispensable part in the structure that created that legendary dynasty. He played in a collective where bigger media stars were always mentioned first, where every explosive moment was usually tied to names known to the whole world, while he quietly fulfilled his role from behind, like a pillar that did not need light but kept the entire system from collapsing. McHale was not the type of player seeking personal recognition. He accepted the supporting role as something inevitable, not because of lacking ambition, but because he understood that the team's victory was more important than his own position in that victory story, In the most tense games, when pressure weighed heavily on every possession, he was always the one ready to do the least noticed jobs, from quiet defense to handling in the area under the basket, without needing to turn them into highlight moments. And that very stability helped the Celtics maintain their strength throughout many seasons. But in return, the spotlight often did not stop on him. Even though his contribution was irreplaceable, he was still often seen as a part of the system more than a separate icon, and that gradually formed in him a special habit. Accepting sacrifice without needing proportionate recognition, without reacting, without demanding, without creating internal conflicts, simply continuing to play the way the team needed while others received media praise. McHale got used to standing in the silence of victory, where he understood that his value did not lie in fame but in efficiency. But the price of that silence was a lasting feeling that few noticed, the feeling that he was always close to the light but never truly stood in it. He did not speak it out, never turned it into an issue. Because in the culture of the Celtics in that era, sacrifice did not need to be explained, and McHale accepted it as a natural part of the profession. But over time, that sacrifice did not disappear. It accumulated into a form of quiet memory, where every title, every win, every glorious moment came with an unspoken truth. He was always the one standing next to glory, not the one named with it, and that very thing deeply shaped the way he viewed his career, not as an individual story but as a part in a larger machine, where he chose to work as efficiently as possible, even if that meant he would never be the focal point. And throughout those years, McHale gradually became the model of a very special type of player, someone who did not need recognition to continue contributing, someone who did not need the lights to prove his value. But precisely because of that, his story always carried a different shade, a prolonged quietness amid the cheers, as if he always existed on the border between glory and invisibility. And only those who looked really closely would realize that in every big Celtics victory of that era, there was always a non-noisy but irreplaceable contribution from the man who always stood beside the legends, rather than standing above them. When the championships began to come to Kevin McHale with the Boston Celtics, it was not an explosive emotional moment, as people usually imagine sports glory, but a series of victories recorded in order, discipline, and an almost cold calmness. McHale stood amid the celebrations, amid the cheers and confetti falling like rain, but he rarely was the one showing the strongest emotions. Not because he did not understand the value of victory, but because the way he felt victory had been different for a very long time. Victory for him was not a release from pressure, but the natural reward of a long process full of responsibility, where every game was a task to be completed rather than an opportunity for personal emotional explosion. In the peak seasons with Larry Bird and the entire Celtics team, he won many major titles, became an irreplaceable part in the NBA dominating dynasty. But even when standing at the peak, the feeling he carried was not completely the same as the fulfillment people usually assign to champions, because for McHale, success was always tied to discipline, to self-control, to not being allowed to loosen up even for a moment. And that very thing made his victories carry a very different shade, not the bursting of emotions, but a continuation of responsibility, where he knew that after each title there would be another season, another challenge, another pressure waiting. In the locker rooms after wins, when teammates celebrated, when camera flashes blinked, McHale often kept a familiar quietness, not because he was not happy, but because that joy had never been the only thing he sought in his career. He did not build his life on short-term satisfaction, but on the long-term stability of the job and role, and that made him a very special part of the team, a person always present at the right time, in the right position, but rarely becoming the center of collective emotion, even in the most glorious moments, when the entire Celtics team lifted the trophy. When history was rewritten, McHale still kept a private silence for himself, as if he was observing his own success from a farther perspective, where everything was not only joy but also the sum of thousands of hours of training, pain, sacrifice, and responsibility that never stopped. His personal life also reflected exactly that, a prolonged reservedness, without showmanship, without noise, without letting the outside world touch too deeply. And over time, a feeling of emptiness began to appear alongside the titles. Not failure, but a hard-to-name state, where success no longer brought the full feeling people usually thought, where every victory came with a silence, as if some part inside him had never really been filled. Even though he had stood at the peak of world basketball many times, and that very parallelism between glory and emptiness created one of the deepest aspects in McHale's life. A person who had learned to win very well, but had never learned to feel truly fulfilled in those victories themselves. In the peak, but also harshest years of Kevin McHale, his body began to show signs of wear that no one outside truly saw fully, especially in the late 1980s, when the intensity of play in the National Basketball Association became increasingly fierce. McHale suffered a serious injury to his foot and ankle, a type of damage that could completely change the career of any athlete. But instead of stopping to recover fully, he made a choice that would later shape the entire rest of his career, continuing to play, continuing to appear on the court, continuing to carry the role in the Boston Celtics system, because in a collective used to winning, absence was never something easily accepted, and McHale clearly understood that the team had no time to wait for anyone who weakened, even if it was himself. The days after the injury became a series of games played in silent endurance. He stepped onto the court with a body no longer in perfect condition. Every movement carried a certain level of pain, but no one in the audience could see it clearly, because McHale never turned it into a reason, never used it as an explanation. He played as if everything was still normal, as if his body had no new limits formed, and that very silence made the level of his sacrifice become deeper when he chose to hide the pain rather than share it, chose to let it become part of the habit rather than a problem to be solved publicly. In the locker room, he was not the one complaining, not seeking sympathy, not requesting reduced load. He simply continued his work, just like the way he had been used to since childhood, keeping everything inside and letting actions speak instead of words. But the human body always has limits, and over time, the consecutive games, the non-stop collisions, the prolonged playing minutes, despite the pain, began to leave clearer consequences. Not only temporary pains, but the accumulation of long-term damage, affecting the way he moved, the way he jumped, the way he spun in the area under the basket that was once where he dominated. But even when the decline gradually became undeniable, McHale still did not change his approach. He did not withdraw, did not reduce his role with words, did not create a tension about his physical condition, because for him, continuing to play was not only responsibility to himself, but also responsibility to the collective that had placed trust in him, and that very thing turned his sacrifice into a fixed part of an athlete's life, where pain was not something to avoid, but something to accept as a condition that came with the profession, and in that acceptance, McHale gradually formed a special way of existing, where the body was injured, but the spirit still maintained stability, where pain was not spoken but always present in every movement, every run, every collision. And the most notable thing was that he never let that become his own story, did not turn it into a reason to change how others saw him, did not seek pity, because for him, basketball was not a place to show weakness, but a place to complete the task no matter what state the body was in. And that very persistence made him become a rare model in NBA history, a player not only remembered for technique or titles, but also for the ability to endure beyond his own limits in silence, an endurance that stretched to the point it was no longer a moment, but became a part of his nature, a part of the person he carried throughout his career. When Kevin McHale's playing career came to an end in 1993, It was not an explosive emotional moment as people usually imagine farewells in sports, with no excessive bursting, no grand declarations, no dramatic feeling of a staged ending, but only a gradual withdrawal from a world he had been attached to his whole life, a world of the National Basketball Association, where the sound of the ball bouncing, the sound of shoes scraping on the wooden floor, and the cheers of the audience had once been the familiar heartbeat. And when all those sounds disappeared, what remained was not release, but a silence that stretched to the point of heaviness. McHale left the Boston Celtics not only as a player leaving the court, but as a person leaving the entire structure that had defined himself. And that very change created a void that no title or glorious memory could fill. The early days after retirement, his life became strangely quiet. No more fixed training schedule, no more long flights, no more life and death games. But that quietness did not bring the sense of relief people usually think, but on the contrary, it made everything become clearer, especially the voids that the noise of competition had previously covered, when there was no more basketball court, no more short-term goals, no more weekly pressure to win. McHale began to face himself in a way he had never done while still playing. And in that facing, the emotions suppressed for many years began to rise, not noisy, not sudden, but slowly, like a quiet flow that could not be stopped. He was no longer caught up in the competitive rhythm of life, no more adrenaline moments pushing everything forward. And that very absence made him realize that a part of himself had been built entirely on the continuous motion of basketball. When it all stopped, he not only lost a career, but lost a life structure that had existed since his teenage years. Mornings without a training schedule made time become longer. Afternoons without games made thoughts have more voids, and evenings without playing pressure made memories have the chance to return more clearly, including the injuries, the games played in pain, the decisions to continue playing instead of stopping, all reappearing in a quiet space, with no noise left to cover them. McHale began to understand that the silence of post-retirement life was not like the silence he had been used to when young, because before silence was the place he focused to become better, but now silence was the place he was forced to face himself, with what had been lost, with what could not be regained, and with the emotions he had once learned to keep inside throughout his career. No more cheers meant no more external confirmation. No more competitive rhythm meant no more reason to keep pushing himself forward every day. And in that void, McHale began to feel more clearly something he had never named before. That was the loneliness of a person who had spent his whole life existing in the collective, but was not used to existing when the collective was no longer there. And that very awareness made the post-retirement phase become another chapter in his life. Not an ending, but a quiet transition to a new form of existence, where a person was forced to relearn how to live without relying on the rhythm of the basketball court, a rhythm that had once replaced all personal emotions for decades. When he left the lights of the Boston Celtics, Kevin McHale stepped into a new phase of his life that even he could not clearly imagine, a phase with no more titles to aim for as a player, but only decisions behind the desk, strategic choices, long meetings, and the invisible pressure of rebuilding a team in a completely different environment. When he joined the management and coaching staff at the Minnesota Timberwolves, it was no longer the world of reflexes and instincts like when he was still playing, but the world of analysis, evaluation, and being responsible for results that could not be controlled by legs or personal technique. And that very change opened a new chapter full of challenges where he was no longer defined by scoring plays or defense, but by decisions that could be scrutinized from every side, every player choice, every team-building strategy. Every small change in the team structure became the object of pressure and expectation. But the hardest thing did not lie in management technique, but in the fact that he no longer felt he truly belonged to a clear role like before. Throughout many years of playing, McHale always knew exactly who he was on the court. a part of the system, a link in the wheel of victory. But when he stepped into the new role, he no longer had that feeling. He became the person standing outside the game, trying to influence it from afar but never truly touching its heartbeat like before, and that lost connection gradually created an invisible distance between him and his own work. The seasons passed with results not as expected, making the pressure grow bigger, not only from the media but also from inside the team itself, where everyone looked for answers to the failures. And McHale, with all the experience of a legend on the court, still had to learn to accept that success in the new role did not come in the same way as before. He no longer had the ability to change the situation himself with an excellent game, but had to depend on many factors beyond his control, and that relative helplessness made him begin to feel more clearly the difference between the player and the manager. A difference not only in role, but also in emotion. When he was still a player, everything was direct and clear, win or lose, success or failure. But in the new role, everything became more complex, longer and harder to define, and that made the sense of control he once had on the court almost disappear completely. In the working days at the Timberwolves, there were moments when McHale had to face tense meetings, decisions being questioned, expectations not met, and all of that took place in a space with no more cheers, no more adrenaline, no more clarity of a game in progress. Only the silence of the office and pressure accumulating over time, and that very silence made every failure feel heavier, because there was nothing left to cover or dilute the feeling of disappointment. Over time, McHale began to realize that the new job did not bring him the sense of fulfillment like when he was playing, not because of a complete lack of achievements, but because it did not touch the part of himself he was most familiar with, the part of himself that only lived and reacted in the rhythm of the basketball court, and when that rhythm was no longer there, a void began to form. Not noisy, not sudden, but prolonged and quiet, making him many times wonder whether he was continuing to move forward or just trying to fill the remaining time with a role that no longer gave him the feeling of belonging. That sense of being lost did not come as a shock, but as a slow realization that not every success brought the same meaning, and not every role could replace the feeling of living true to himself like when he was still playing. And in that realization, McHale continued to work, continued to take responsibility, continued to make decisions, but deep inside, he still carried a question without an answer. That after all the years standing in the stadium lights and then standing behind them, where exactly was the place he truly belonged, and whether there was any place that could replace the feeling that once existed when he was still a direct part of the game or not. When he left Minnesota, Kevin McHale stepped into a new chapter with the hope of regaining the sense of control he once had in his playing years. And the head coaching role at the Houston Rockets was seen as an opportunity for him to redefine himself in an environment that still carried the familiar heartbeat of the National Basketball Association. But reality quickly showed that this was not a return of power, but a completely different form of challenge, where every decision of his was no longer measured by the feeling on the court, but by the final result displayed on the scoreboard. McHale stepped into the coaching job with the seriousness and experience of a legend, but he also quickly realized that leading a team was not the same as playing in it, because in the coaching position, he was no longer the one directly creating the difference with his hands or feet, but the one who had to trust in the operation of an entire complex system that he could only adjust from afar. In the first seasons, the Houston Rockets under his leadership had periods of good play, had wins with clear tactical marks, but stability was always something out of reach. The team had short, flourishing phases, then fell into losing streaks. And in the harsh, competitive environment of the NBA, that lack of stability quickly turned into pressure, not only from management, but also from the media and fans. Every loss was followed by questions. Every decision was analyzed again from many angles. And McHale, who was once used to controlling the pace of the game when he was playing, now had to face the reality that he could not control every variable like before. That relative helplessness gradually became a mental burden, not because he lacked tactical ability, but because he no longer had the direct feeling of influencing the result in the way he once knew. When he was still a player, he could change the situation with one play, but when coaching, he had to wait for others to execute his ideas. And between idea and reality, there was always a gap that could not be completely filled. Over time, the pressure of results grew bigger, and the initial expectations of a quick revival were gradually replaced by increasingly exhausted patience. McHale still continued to work, still prepared tactics, still tried to build a competitive collective. But every season that passed carried unavoidable disappointments, and finally, the decision to fire him came as something inevitable in the harsh world of professional sports. What was worth saying did not lie in the firing itself, but in the way it happened, with no public resistance, no loud arguments, no strong statements, only the quiet end of a term full of effort but not complete. And McHale left Houston just like the way he had left many other phases in his life, in silence, not seeking attention, not turning failure into a bigger story than it actually was. He simply walked away, carrying the experience, carrying the pressure, and carrying the feeling that he had once again lost a role he had tried to build. And in that moment, a familiar loop in his life appeared again, where every time he tried to redefine himself off the basketball court, the world reminded him that not every new position brought the feeling of belonging, and not every effort ended in stability. Only one familiar thing remained from long ago. The silence after a chapter ended, and the wordless question about what would come next, when a person who had once lived his whole life in the rhythm of victory and defeat was no longer at the center of any game anymore. In all the long and eventful chapters of Kevin McHale's life, no phase was as deeply shattering as the moment he faced his daughter's illness, Sasha McHale, who had suffered from lupus for many consecutive years, a prolonged, quiet, but persistent autoimmune disease that made his family step into a journey no longer related to basketball, no longer related to victory or defeat, but only to waiting, worry, and hope, day by day, hour by hour, test result by test result. During that period, everything that once defined McHale's life seemed to recede into the background. The roles at the Houston Rockets, or the pressures in the National Basketball Association, became much smaller compared to the hospital room, where a father had to learn to stand and watch his child fight something he could not defend against with any technique or experience he had ever had. Sasha was not only his daughter, but also a rare part in his life where he did not need to keep an image, did not need to be strong, did not need to be a legend. But that very place became the most painful one, because there was no tactic that could change the outcome, no lineup that could turn fate around, no waiting time long enough for everything to become stable again. As the illness dragged on, the McHale family lived in a state of both hope and exhaustion, where every day that passed carried the fragility of something uncontrollable. And then the worst moment also came, when Sasha passed away at a very young age, a loss with no way to prepare in advance, no way to get used to, no way to accept completely, because it was not like any failure in his career, not like any injury on the court. It was the permanent disappearance of the person he loved the most. And in that moment, the entire emotional structure McHale had built throughout his life seemed to collapse, not noisily, not dramatically, but quietly, deeply and irreversibly. He had once been used to enduring injuries, enduring failures, enduring work pressure. But there was no preparation for enduring a void that would never be filled, a void with no recovery time, no new season, no chance to redo. And from that point on, his life was no longer measured by achievements or roles, but measured by the absence of a voice he would never hear again. Those around him spoke of McHale as a person who continued to stand firm, continued to work, continued to live, But behind that continuation was a change that could not be seen. A part of him seemed to have stopped forever in the moment of losing his child. Not in a noisy way, but in the quietest way possible, as if a door inside him had closed and would never open again. From then on, every victory, every failure, every professional decision carried a different meaning, no longer the most important thing because the most important thing was no longer present. And even though he still continued to walk in life, still appeared in his job, still maintained his role in the basketball world, deep inside, there was a truth that never changed, that there were losses that did not create an ending, but created a different existence, where a person no longer lived as before, but only learned to carry the pain as an inseparable part of himself. After the tragedy of losing his daughter Sasha, Kevin McHale did not disappear from the basketball world, but the way he existed in that world had changed forever. He still returned to coaching and management work in the National Basketball Association, still appeared on the bench, still participated in tactical meetings, still talked about games, people, and systems like before, but all of that now took place in a completely different state, a state that outside almost no one noticed immediately. Because McHale had never been the type to show excessive emotions in public, he did not cry in front of the camera, did not make statements that deeply revealed his inner self, did not turn the pain into a story to share widely. And that very silence made many people only see a coach who continued to work as normal. But those who had been close to him long enough all realized that something had changed permanently, not in the way he spoke, but in the way he paused in the silences, and the eyes that were less focused on the excitement of victory than before, and in the increasingly clear quietness when the game ended. He returned to work very quickly after a short time, not because the pain had disappeared, but because work became one of the few things left that helped him keep a stable rhythm of life, a way not to be completely swallowed by the personal void. But even when continuing to work, McHale still avoided talking about what had happened in his private life. Not because he wanted to hide it, but because there were pains that for him could not be expressed in the language of the public. Those around him began to notice that change over time, not as a clear collapse, but as a gradual withdrawal from emotional expressions that had once been very normal in sports environments. He became quieter, shared less, reacted less to moments that before could have made him express more. And what was notable was that that change did not make him weaker in his work, but made him more distant from the world around him, as if there was an invisible glass separating him from everyone, a glass formed from an unhealable loss in the meetings. McHale still participated fully, still made decisions, still analyzed games, but between the short words and the prolonged pauses, people could feel that something was no longer intact. Not a lack of focus, but the presence of a pain that was never mentioned. Because, for McHale, that pain did not belong to the public space. It belonged to another world, where there were no cameras, no press, no questions, and no answers. And that very separation made him become a person living in two parallel states. One side was the professional role he still maintained in a stable way, and the other side was the inner life that had completely changed after the tragedy. People who had worked with him for many years said that he was no longer the same as before, not because he had become weaker, but because he had become deeper in a harder-to-reach way, as if all emotions had been pushed inside instead of being expressed outside, and that created a special image of McHale in this phase of his life. A man who still stood in the middle of the professional sports world, but no longer completely belonged to its noisy rhythm anymore. A person who still continued to work, but always carried a silence that no one could break. And that very silence became the deepest mark of him after the tragedy. A mark that did not lie in what he said, but in what he never spoke out. Like a part of memory kept forever inside, without needing to be explained and without needing to be recognized, simply existing with him in every remaining moment of his life. After all the events that had passed in his life, Kevin McHale no longer lived in the light of his peak years, but he also did not disappear from the basketball world. Instead, he continued to exist in a very different way, quieter, more discreet, and more separated. In the environment of the National Basketball Association, people still saw him appear occasionally, in advisory roles, coaching, or analysis, but no longer with the thick presence like before. No longer the image of a person always standing at the center of every attention. His life became more narrowed, not in the sense of losing value, but in the sense of gradually reducing the need to appear in public. As if after everything that had happened, McHale chose a smaller space to exist, where he could keep everything at a controllable level, not having to face the outside world too much, not having to explain too much about himself, and also not needing to carry the image of a legend everywhere all the time. He did not try to talk about the past, did not try to interpret the losses, did not turn his life into a story for others to analyze or empathize with, because for him, there were things that did not belong to words, but to memories, and those memories did not need to be shared to become real. They already existed in him as an inseparable part. What made McHale's life in this phase special was not what he did, but what he no longer did. No more dense appearances in front of the media, no more long answers about his career or the past, no more moments placed under the stadium lights. Instead, it was a slower, more even, and almost still rhythm of life, where he spent more time on privacy, on the remaining family, and on thoughts that no one else could touch. In that silence, the memory of Sasha still existed as an irreplaceable part of his life, not in a noisy or dramatized way, but in a persistent and prolonged way, like an underground flow always present, no matter how calm the surface was. McHale never tried to heal in the way the world usually expected. There was no complete return of the previous person, no clear moment that marked that everything had become okay again. Instead, it was continuing to live with what had happened, a state in which the pain did not disappear, but only changed shape, became less visible but never left. People who had known him for many years understood that he was still himself in some way, still the calm, unshowy man who did not seek attention, but at the same time also realized that there was a part in him that had stopped at some point in the past and would never continue to develop in the old way again. His presence at basketball events, when it happened, always carried a quietness hard to name, as if he was observing the world from a farther distance than before. Not because he had left it, but because he no longer belonged to it in a complete way anymore, and that very thing made McHale's image in this phase become symbolic of a very rare type of existence, a person who did not completely break, but also never returned intact, a person who continued to walk without a clear ending point for what had been lost. And in that continuation, he carried a simple but heavy truth, that there were wounds that never closed completely, only learned to live with them in silence. And that very silence became the clearest part of who he was in the final years of this long and eventful journey. In the final years of the long journey full of glory and loss, Kevin McHale began to look back at his entire career in a completely different way. No longer from the perspective of an athlete still playing, no longer from the perspective of a coach or a manager in the National Basketball Association, but from the perspective of a person who had gone through almost every level of success and failure, of glory and emptiness, of recognition, and the silences that were never spoken. He looked back at the titles with the Boston Celtics, the NBA championships, the glorious seasons, the moments when the world once called his name as part of history. And in a very quiet moment, he realized that all of that, no matter how great, could not change one single truth in his life, that there were losses that could never be replaced. No championship big enough to compensate for Sasha's absence, no Hall of Fame title that could make that void smaller, and no praise from the outside world that could touch the place where that pain existed when he was young. McHale once believed that success could bring fulfillment, that the farther he went in his career, the more complete his personal life would become. But over time, he gradually understood that glory and inner life did not always go in the same direction, and sometimes they existed parallel like two worlds that never touched each other. He stood amid the memories of historic games, of times lifting the trophy, of endless cheers, but all those images now carried a different shade. No longer pure pride, but a contrast with something deeper and more private, where the most important things in his life were no longer present, where his daughter's laughter no longer rang out, where the simplest moments that once created the meaning of life had disappeared forever, and that very contrast made him realize something that not everyone had the chance to understand, that success, no matter how big, was only a part of life, not the whole life, and it did not have the ability to heal wounds that belonged to love, family, and loss. When looking back at the years that had passed, McHale no longer saw his career as a continuous chain of victories, but as a parallel journey between two straight lines. One side was the light of titles and recognition, and the other side was the darkness of the things he could never keep, and the distance between those two straight lines over time became clearer than ever. He understood that there were things in life that could not be measured by numbers, could not be defined by achievements, and could not be replaced by any form of success. Those things belonged to people, belonged to memories, belonged to love, and once lost, there was no way to go back. In the silence of the final years, McHale did not try to deny that, nor did he try to change it. He only accepted that his life had been shaped by both what he had achieved and what he could never get back, and that very acceptance, though heavy, became the final part of a long journey where all glory was looked back on, not with pure pride, but with a profound understanding that no achievement, no matter how great, could replace a presence that was no longer there. In the final years of the long journey full of glory, loss, and silence, Kevin McHale was no longer mentioned only as a legend of the Boston Celtics or an icon of the National Basketball Association, but became the image of a person who had gone through almost every extreme of human life. The peak of fame, physical sacrifice, professional pressure, unfulfilled roles after retirement, and most importantly, the losses that could not be named, all intertwined to create a life that was not simply a story about basketball, but a story about endurance stretching through many decades, where each phase carried a different form of challenge. When he was young, he endured the silence of childhood. When he grew up, he endured the pressure of the NBA. When he reached the peak, he endured the shadow of glory itself. And when he left the court, he endured the emptiness of no longer having a clear role. Then finally he endured the greatest loss of a lifetime, the passing of his daughter Sasha, a wound that never closed completely. But what made McHale's entire story different was not the number of events, but the way he faced them. Without noise, without showmanship, without seeking pity from the outside world. He never collapsed in a way the public could see. There were no public breakdown moments, no statements dramatizing his life, only continuation. A quiet but steadfast continuation, as if he understood that there were battles that did not need an audience, and there were pains that did not need to be proven to become real. Throughout his career, he had built a legacy not only based on excellent basketball skills, the championships with the Boston Celtics, or his position in NBA history, but also based on a rare quality, the ability to stand firm in silence, the ability to continue doing his duty even when inside he was being eroded. And that very thing made him become a special model, not of perfection, but of resilience, a person who was never defined only by winning moments, but by the entire long journey of not giving up, even when no one fully saw everything he had to carry. When looking back, McHale's life was not a straight line upward of success, but a series of phases intertwined between light and darkness, between collective peaks and personal voids, between times of being honored and moments that belonged to no recognition at all. And in all of that, he still continued to exist, not as an absolute winner, but as a person who had learned to live with everything imperfect, incomplete, and unchangeable. The greatest legacy of his, if looked deeper than titles and statistics, did not lie in how many championships he had won or how excellently he had played, but in the way he existed after everything, the way he walked through the losses without disappearing, the way he kept his calmness in a world that always demanded strong emotions, and the way he accepted that not every wound could be healed, but every life still had to continue. Precisely because of that, the final image of McHale was not a brilliant, glorious moment, but a quiet, stable, enduring presence. A man who had gone through almost every form of challenge a person could experience, but still stood there. Not perfect, not intact, but still continuing to exist with everything that remained. And in that existence, people saw not only a basketball legend, but a profound lesson about humanity. That strength sometimes does not lie in winning everything, but in not disappearing before the things that cannot be won, and that is exactly what made Kevin McHale's story become a legacy that goes beyond the basketball court. A legacy of endurance, of silence, and of a life that had reached the end of the journey while still keeping the most important thing, the ability to keep walking. Even when nothing was intact like before, looking back at Kevin McHale's entire story, people not only see a legend of the Boston Celtics with 3 NBA championships and the prestigious Hall of Fame position, but also see a life shaped by the deep layers of silence of pain, where success always walked alongside loss and glory was never enough to fill the inner void. From a boy who grew up in reservedness in Hibbing, Minnesota, he learned to live in silence, turned basketball into a refuge, then stepped into the NBA with a role that was not central but always sacrificed quietly beside icons like Larry Bird. But the most tragic thing did not lie on the court, but in what happened outside the lights: prolonged injuries, a coaching career full of pressure at the Minnesota Timberwolves and Houston Rockets, and especially the immeasurable pain of losing his daughter Sasha. Those details were not only events, but deep cuts that made his life never return intact. McHale did not collapse in front of the public. He continued to work, continued to live, continued to exist, but that very continuation carried a quiet sadness that no words could fully describe. From this story, American people can see a very human truth. Success, titles, or recognition cannot heal profound personal losses. McHale had everything an athlete could dream of, but still had to live with an irreplaceable void in his family and inner self. The lesson here is not pessimistic, but an awakening. Cherish health, family, and the present moments, because they are more important than any fame. At the same time, his story also honors a form of strength rarely mentioned in American culture: the strength of silent endurance, of continuing to walk even when not intact. McHale was not only a basketball legend, but also a symbol of a person who had lived fully both glory and loss, and still chose to stand firm until the end. If Kevin McHale's story has touched you, please hit subscribe to the channel to continue following the journeys behind the spotlight of sports legends. Thank you for listening to a life full of glory, but also many losses, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore untold stories.